The year is 1976. The location is the deep silence of low Earth orbit, 300 kilometers above the surface of the planet. Imagine the scene through the eyes of a Soviet cosmonaut. You are drifting in the black void, safely ensconced inside the metal hull of a Salyut space station. Below you, the Soviet Union passes in a wash of white clouds and brown topography. The station is your fortress. It is the high ground. For 2 decades, space has been the one domain where the sensory overload of the Cold War falls silent. Here, physics rules, not politics. Objects move in predictable, elliptical paths. If something is coming toward you, you see it on radar hours, sometimes days, in advance. You calculate the intercept. You adjust. Mathematics provides safety. But then, the mathematics break. In this terrifying scenario, which kept the highest-ranking generals of the Soviet Ministry of Defense awake in a cold sweat, the radar does not ping until it is too late. A dark shape emerges from the horizon, not drifting like a capsule but maneuvering like a fighter jet. It is white, vast, and winged. It does not spin or tumble, it glides. It approaches the Salyut station with a predatory silence. The cosmonaut looks out the viewport. This is not a cylinder, it is a plane. A massive, delta-winged aircraft operating in a vacuum. The intruder rolls on its axis. The cargo bay doors on its spine slowly hiss open, revealing a cavernous, empty belly dark and deep enough to swallow a bus. A mechanical arm, slender and insect-like, unfolds from the darkness. There is no radio contact, no diplomatic greeting, just the silent mechanical whir of the arm extending, grappling the Soviet station and pulling it into the darkness of the cargo bay. The doors close. The white ship fires its thrusters, dips its nose, and dives back into the atmosphere, taking the pride of the Soviet space program and its crew back to American soil. This was not a science fiction movie. This was the nightmare scenario. For the men sitting in the smoke-filled conference rooms of the Keldysh Institute of Applied Mathematics in Moscow, this was not a fantasy. It was a mathematical certainty. They were looking at the blueprints of a new American machine, a vehicle that defied every economic and scientific logic of spaceflight they understood. To them, the Americans were not building a transport truck. They were building a pirate ship. The confusion in Moscow was absolute. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union felt they understood the rhythm of the space race. It was a game of prestige and throw weight. You build a rocket, you put a capsule on top, you shoot it up, and it comes down in a parachute. It was expensive, dangerous, and single-use. The Soviets were good at this. They had mastered the brutish efficiency of the Soyuz. But then, intelligence reports began to trickle in from the West regarding a new project known as the Space Transportation System, or simply, the Shuttle. The initial reports were baffling. The Americans claimed they were building a reusable space truck to make access to orbit cheap and routine. They claimed it would carry commercial satellites, science experiments, and perhaps the occasional military payload. They painted a picture of a benign civilian infrastructure project, a railway to the stars. But the Soviet engineers at the Keldysh Institute, led by the brilliant mathematician Mstislav Keldysh, began to run the numbers on the American public design specifications. And the numbers did not add up. They did not add up at all. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden histories and high-stakes mysteries of the Cold War, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact for more stories like this. The discrepancy that froze the blood of the Soviet analysts was the sheer size and weight of the proposed vehicle. The orbiter was massive. It dragged 29 tons of dry weight into orbit. It had huge delta wings. It had a heat shield designed for temperatures far exceeding a normal re-entry. Why? If the goal was simply to deliver satellites, as NASA claimed, the design was a disaster. It was like using a Ferrari to deliver the mail. The wings were heavy dead weight during the ascent. The heat shielding was overkill. The payload bay was 15 feet wide by 60 feet long dimensions that didn't match any known commercial satellite on the drawing board. Mstislav Keldysh and his team looked at the payload penalty. To haul those massive wings into orbit, the Americans were sacrificing tons of potential cargo capacity. No engineer would do this unless the wings were necessary, and wings in space are useless. Wings are only useful in the atmosphere. This led to the first terrifying conclusion. The Americans intended to bring something heavy back down. But what? A science experiment? A few rocks? No. The calculations showed the payload bay could hold up to 65,000 pounds. There was no scientific sample in the world that weighed that much. The The confusion deepened when the Soviet intelligence services, the GRU and the KGB, acquired details about the shuttle's planned launch site at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The Americans were spending billions to upgrade the facility for the shuttle. Vandenberg is used for one thing: polar orbits. A polar orbit is a specific path that takes a satellite over the North and South poles. As the Earth rotates beneath the satellite eventually flies over every single square inch of the planet. It is the primary orbit for spy satellites. But the Keldysh team noticed something else. The projected thrust and fuel capacity of the shuttle allowed for a specific maneuver called a single-pass cross-range. This is where the nightmare truly began to take shape. In a standard re-entry, a spacecraft follows a ballistic arc. It falls where gravity tells it to fall, but the shuttle's massive delta wings gave it cross-range capability. It could dip into the atmosphere, use its wings to glide, and turn up to 2,000 kilometers to the left or right of its original path, and then land. The Soviet analysts ran the simulation. They plugged in the variables: a launch from Vandenberg, a polar orbit, a sudden dive into the atmosphere, a sharp banking turn using those massive wings, and a landing back in the United States. When they overlaid this flight path onto a map of the Earth, the silence in the room became suffocating. The trajectory took the shuttle directly over Moscow. Specifically, the simulation showed the shuttle launching from California, flying south over the pole, coming up the other side of the Earth, and passing over the Soviet Union. It could then dive, open its bay doors, snag a payload, and use its aerodynamic cross-range capability to glide back to a friendly runway before the Soviet Union could even complete a single rotation of the Earth. It was a first orbit capture. The Soviets were staring at a ghost, a phantom weapon. They saw a scenario where the space shuttle could launch, intercept a Soviet Almaz military space station or a critical reconnaissance satellite, physically capture it with the manipulator arm, close the doors, and land all within 90 minutes. They wouldn't just be destroying Soviet assets. They would be stealing them. They would be dissecting Soviet technology, analyzing their codes, and reverse engineering their secrets. This abduction theory became the dominant explanation for the shuttle's existence within the Kremlin. It was the only theory that made the math work. The economic justification NASA provided was seen as a lie. Why else, the Soviet generals argued, would they build a spacecraft with wings that big? Why else would they need a 60-foot cargo bay? Why else would they sacrifice so much efficiency? To the suspicious Soviet mind, the inefficiency of the shuttle was proof of its sinister intent. The stakes could not have been higher. By 1976, the Soviet Union relied heavily on its space-based assets. Their nuclear early warning system, known as OCO, relied on satellites in high elliptical orbits to detect the thermal bloom of American Minuteman missiles launching from the silos in North Dakota. Their naval reconnaissance satellites tracked the American carrier battle groups. If the shuttle was indeed a space pirate, as they feared, the Americans could systematically blind the Soviet Union. They could pluck the eyes out of the Soviet defense network one by one, bringing them back to Earth for inspection. The panic was not limited to engineers. It reached the Politburo. Dmitry Ustinov, the powerful Minister of Defense, demanded answers. He wanted to know how to stop it. He wanted to know how to track it. But the incident, this mathematical realization, had revealed a gaping hole in Soviet defenses. The shuttle, if it performed this diving maneuver, would behave like nothing else on radar. It would be a hypersonic glider, moving at Mach 25, surrounded by a sheath of ionized plasma that absorbed radar waves. It might be invisible during the most critical phase of its attack. The Soviets were looking at a weapon that could decapitate their strategic awareness without firing a single shot. And the terrifying part was that the Americans were building it in plain sight, broadcasting the launches on television and smiling as they called it a truck. The Soviet military establishment was paralyzed by a mix of fear and admiration. They were witnessing a technological leap that seemed impossible. How could the Americans build a heat shield that survived such a complex re-entry? How could they build a computer fast enough to handle the aerodynamics of a brick flying at hypersonic speeds? As 1977 approached, the phantom abduction became the primary driver of Soviet space policy. They had to assume the threat was real. They had to assume that every time the shuttle launched, a Soviet satellite was at risk of vanishing. But this was just the beginning of the mystery. The engineers at Keldysh had identified the potential threat, but they had not yet figured out the mechanism. How, specifically, would the Americans find the satellites in the vastness of space? How would they approach without triggering the collision alarms? The investigation turned inward. They began to look for the invisible infrastructure that would support such a theft. They began to scour the skies for the support network of this grand American heist. They needed to find the smoking gun that proved the shuttle was a weapon. And what they found, or what they thought they found, would lead them down a rabbit hole of paranoia that would cost the Soviet economy billions of rubles. They were about to chase a ghost, a reflection in the mirror, convinced it was a monster. The hunt for the truth had begun. But the Soviets were looking through a lens distorted by their own fears. They were about to make a series of wrong conclusions that would haunt them for the next decade. The order to investigate came from the very top of the Kremlin hierarchy. It landed on the heavy oak desk of Dmitry Ustinov, the Soviet Minister of Defense. Ustinov was a man who did not believe in coincidences. He was a titan of the Soviet military-industrial complex, a man who had overseen the production of everything from T-72 tanks to intercontinental ballistic missiles. To him, technology was ideology made metal. And he knew one truth above all else: the Americans did not spend billions of dollars on peaceful space trucks. In the freezing winter of 1976, the Soviet military apparatus was mobilized to answer one question: what is the shuttle really for? The investigation began not with spies in trench coats, but with mathematicians in woolen sweaters. The Keldysh Institute became the nerve center of a frantic obsession. They were given unlimited resources and a mandate to crack the American code. But the more they looked, the more the mystery deepened. The investigators started by analyzing the open-source material the Americans were publishing. This was the first source of their confusion. NASA was publishing glossy brochures, technical papers, and detailed flight plans in magazines like Aviation Week and Space Technology. To the secretive Soviet mind, this transparency was the ultimate deception. They reasoned that no military power would openly publish the specifications of a strategic weapon. Therefore, the data in the magazines must be fake. It must be a smokescreen designed to hide the true capabilities of the vehicle. So, they assumed the worst. They took the NASA numbers and applied a paranoia coefficient. If NASA said the cross range was 2,000 kilometers, the Soviet generals assumed it was actually 3,000. If NASA said the payload was 65,000 pounds, the Soviets assumed it was 100,000. They were building a monster in their minds, constructing a phantom capability based on the belief that the Americans were lying about the shuttle's limitations. As 1977 rolled around and the Space Shuttle Enterprise began its atmospheric drop tests in California, the paranoia shifted into high gear. The Soviet investigation fractured into three distinct theories, each more terrifying than the last. These were the wrong conclusions that would drive Soviet strategy for a decade. The first theory was the decapitation strike. General designers at the NPO Molniya Bureau looked at the shuttle's heat shield. It was composed of thousands of individual silica tiles. It was complex, fragile, and incredibly expensive. Why use such a system? The Soviets used ablative heat shields, thick layers of resin that burned away. It was cheap and reliable. The only reason to use reusable tiles, they argued, was for a rapid turnaround. The analysts painted a grim picture. A fleet of shuttles launching, bombing, landing, rearming, and launching again. They envisioned the shuttle not as a transport, but as a hypersonic bomber. The dive scenario became a legendary fear within the Soviet air defense forces. The theory went like this. The shuttle launches from Vandenberg into a polar orbit. It flies south, crossing the Antarctic, and comes up the back door of the Soviet Union, approaching from the Indian Ocean. In this scenario, the shuttle initiates a depressed trajectory re-entry. Instead of coming in high and slow like a capsule, it dives deep into the atmosphere while still moving at Mach 20. It uses its wings to skip off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond. To Soviet radar operators, this would look like a glitch. The shuttle would be flying below the horizon of the massive early warning radars that were pointed north, watching for ICBMs coming over the Arctic. By the time the shuttle popped up on the radar screens over central Russia, it would be 3 minutes away from Moscow. It could drop a single nuclear weapon on the Kremlin before the air defense forces could even scramble a single MiG-25 aircraft. This was the first strike nightmare. The shuttle was a sniper rifle pointed at the head of the Politburo. The investigation team spent months trying to prove this wasn't possible, but the aerodynamics held up. The shuttle could theoretically do it. And because it could, the Soviets had to assume it would. The second theory was the space mine layer. The massive cargo bay was the focus here. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans were developing small autonomous killer satellites. The investigators theorized that a single shuttle mission could deploy hundreds of these small mines into the orbital paths of Soviet communication satellites. These mines would sit dormant, waiting for a signal. Then, at the outbreak of war, they would detonate simultaneously, turning the terrifying silence of space into a debris field of shredded Soviet metal. But it was the third theory that truly obsessed the Soviet leadership, the one that returned to the initial incident scenario, the shuttle as a kidnapper. This theory was bolstered by the Lapérouse analysis, named after a French explorer, which became a code name for the study of orbital maneuvers. The Soviet mathematicians looked at the specific inclination of the shuttle's planned launches. They realized that the shuttle's orbit would frequently synchronize with the orbits of the Salyut space stations. The investigation uncovered a chilling detail about the shuttle's payload bay. It was equipped with manipulator arm grapple fixtures and retention latches that seemed designed not just to hold things in, but to grab things out. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, sent frantic requests to their agents in the United States. Find out about the arm. What is the grip strength? What is the reach? The answers they got were disturbing. The arm, built by the Canadians, was precise enough to handle delicate payloads, but strong enough to move massive weights. To the Soviets, this was the final piece of the puzzle. The shuttle was a pirate ship. It was designed to fly up to a Soviet Almaz spy station, grapple it, stuff it into the bay, and bring it back to Earth. The investigation reached a fever pitch in 1978. The Soviet leadership felt naked. They had spent decades building a wall of secrecy around their technology. Now, the Americans had built a machine that could simply fly over the wall and steal the secrets. The psychological impact of this investigation cannot be overstated. It created a sense of inferiority and helplessness. The Soviet Union was stuck with dumb rockets, expendable tubes of aluminum, while the Americans were building a sci-fi spaceplane. This desperation led to the ultimate wrong conclusion. In a secret meeting of the Council of Defense, Dmitry Ustinov slammed his fist on the table. He declared that if the Americans had a shuttle, the Soviet Union must have a shuttle. It didn't matter that the Soviet economy was stagnating. It didn't matter that their scientists couldn't find a clear civilian use for such a vehicle. It didn't matter that they had no commercial satellites large enough to require it. The logic was purely reactive. If they have a sword, we must have a shield. And if their sword is a spaceplane, our shield must be a spaceplane. Thus, the Buran program was born. It was the most expensive military project in the history of the Soviet Union. It was a direct copy of the American design, compelled by the fear generated by the investigation. They decided to build a carbon copy of the shuttle, not because they needed it, but because they needed to understand what the Americans were doing. It was cargo cult, engineering at the highest level. They were building the shape, hoping to understand the function. But even as they poured billions of rubles into the Buran, the Soviet investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. There was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Why were the Americans making the shuttle so complex? Why the tiles? Why the main engines? The Americans were struggling with the technology. The main engines were blowing up on the test stands. The tiles were falling off. The project was over budget and behind schedule. To a rational observer, this might suggest the project was a boondoggle, a bureaucratic mistake. But the Soviet investigators, trapped in their hall of mirrors, saw this struggle as further proof of the weapon's potency. If it is this hard to build, they reasoned, the capability it offers must be godlike. They were chasing a phantom. They were attributing a level of strategic genius to the Americans that simply wasn't there. They believed the shuttle was part of a grand, unified strategy to dominate the cosmos. They had no idea that on the other side of the world, in Washington, D.C. and at NASA headquarters, the situation was radically different. While the Soviets were seeing a silent assassin, the Americans were seeing something else entirely. The Soviet investigation had found answers, but they were the answers to the wrong questions. They had built a legend around the shuttle that turned it into the ultimate weapon. As the 1970s came to a close, the Soviets were preparing for a war in space against a death glider that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the true story of the shuttle, the story of compromise, budget cuts, and conflicting requirements, was a secret the Americans were keeping even from themselves. The Soviets were looking for a master plan. What they were about to discover was a master class in bureaucratic chaos. While the Soviet generals were pacing the floors of the Kremlin, Analyzing the shuttle as if it were a masterpiece of strategic warfare, the reality in Washington, D.C. was far more chaotic. The source of the Soviet nightmare was not a secret bunker of war-hungry generals. It was a budget committee hearing. To understand the machine that terrified the East, we have to look at the desperate situation of NASA in the early 1970s. The Apollo program was ending. The budget was being slashed. NASA needed a new mission to survive. They pitched the Space Transportation System, a reusable space truck to make orbit cheap. But the mathematics of money were harsher than the mathematics of orbit. NASA could not afford to build the shuttle alone. They needed a partner with deep pockets. Enter the United States Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO. This partnership was the source of the mystery. It was a marriage of convenience that would dictate the physical shape of the space shuttle and, inadvertently, convince the Soviets that World War III was imminent. The Air Force agreed to support the shuttle program, but they had a list of non-negotiable demands. They didn't care about science experiments. They cared about putting massive spy satellites, like the KH-9 Hexagon and the upcoming KH-11 Kennen, into polar orbits. And they had one specific, paranoid requirement of their own. It was called Reference Mission 3B. The Air Force demanded that the shuttle be able to launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, fly a single orbit around the Earth to deploy or service a satellite, and then land immediately back at Vandenberg. This sounds simple, but physically, it is a nightmare. In the 90 minutes it takes the shuttle to fly around the world, the Earth rotates beneath it by about 1,100 miles to the east. If the shuttle launched south, by the time it came back up the other side of the planet, Vandenberg Air Force Base would have moved far to the east of the shuttle's orbital track. To get back to the runway, the shuttle would have to fly sideways. It needed to deviate from its ballistic path and glide over 1,000 miles through the upper atmosphere to catch up with the base. This maneuver required cross-range capability. To achieve this cross-range, the shuttle could not be the simple, straight-wing glider NASA engineers originally wanted. It had to have massive, heavy, delta-shaped wings to generate lift in the thin, hypersonic air. It needed a heavy heat shield to survive the friction of that long, gliding turn. This was the answer to the Soviet mystery. The massive wings were not for bombing Moscow. They were not for diving below radar to deliver a nuclear decapitation strike. They were built so that if a spy satellite launch was aborted, the shuttle could return home safely to California instead of ditching a billion-dollar payload into the Pacific Ocean. The terrifying abduction profile the Soviets had modeled the launch, the grab, and the quick return was technically possible, but it was a side effect, not the primary intent. The Americans had built a moving van with the engine of a race car simply because the military wanted a guarantee they could park it in the garage on the first try. But if the intent was mundane, the technology required to achieve it was a display of American dominance that was truly staggering. While the Soviets struggled to perfect their heavy-lift rockets, American engineers were solving problems that shouldn't have been solvable. The shuttle was a leap into the future that left the rest of the world gasping. Consider the invisible shield, the thermal protection system. The Soviets used ablative shields, heavy resins that burned away. They were crude, single-use, and heavy. For the shuttle to perform the cross-range maneuver the Air Force demanded, it needed a shield that was light, reusable, and could withstand 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit without changing shape. American chemists at Lockheed created a silica fiber tile that was 90% air. It was a material so advanced it seemed like magic. You could take a cube of this material, heat it in a furnace until it glowed white-hot, and then pick it up by the corners with your bare fingers seconds later. The heat dissipated so fast it wouldn't burn your skin. 24,000 of these tiles were glued to the belly of the orbiter. To the Soviet analysts looking at the spy photos, this tiled skin looked like dragon scales. It implied a level of material science that was decades ahead of Soviet capabilities. Then there were the engines. The Space Shuttle main engines, or SSMEs. The Soviets were masters of combustion, but they solved problems with brute force. They built engines with multiple combustion chambers to manage the pressure. The Americans, however, decided to build a staged combustion engine running on liquid hydrogen, the most temperamental fuel in existence, and make it reusable. The computer power required just to keep the SSMEs from exploding was greater than the computing power of an entire Apollo capsule. The engine controllers monitored the pumps and valves 50 times a second. This was the true American dominance. It wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about the ecosystem of innovation. To build the shuttle, the US had to invent new alloys, new ceramics, and new digital flight control systems. While the Soviet investigators at the Keldysh Institute were drawing red lines on a map showing nuclear strikes, the Americans were fighting a war against physics. The irony was palpable. The shuttle was designed by a committee, compromised by politics, and wildly over budget. It was a fragile, temperamental beast. The tiles fell off if you looked at them wrong. The engines cracked, the plumbing leaked. But from the outside, from the perspective of the KGB agents watching the rollout of the Enterprise, it looked like a sleek, monolithic predator. They didn't see the budget cuts. They saw the delta wings. They didn't know about the reference Mission 3B abort requirement. They only saw the cross-range capability that allowed it to fly over the Kremlin. The Americans had inadvertently built the perfect psychological weapon. They had created a machine so complex, so unlike anything else in history, that the enemy projected their worst nightmares onto it. By 1979, as the first orbital flight approached, the Americans were just hoping the thing wouldn't blow up on the pad. The Soviets, however, were convinced that the moment Columbia cleared the tower, the strategic balance of the Cold War would shift forever. They believed the space pirate was coming. And in a way, they were right. The shuttle did have the capability to capture satellites. The arm was designed to grapple payloads. The Americans had even practiced proximity operations. The pieces were there. The capability was real. But the intent was the missing variable. As Part 3 concludes, we stand at the precipice. The shuttle is about to launch. The Soviets have built their entire defensive strategy around a ghost story, and soon a specific event would occur, a confrontation in the blackness of space that would bring these two narratives crashing together. The Soviets were about to get the proof they had been hunting for, but it would not come from a spy report. It would come from the shuttle itself, staring back at them. The theoretical nightmare remained just that theoretical until November 1984. This was the moment the mathematics turned into a photograph and the Soviet paranoia turned into cold, hard terror. The mission was STS-51A. The space shuttle was Discovery. For years, the analysts at the Keldysh Institute had argued about grapple fixtures and payload retention. They had debated whether the American robot arm was strong enough to hold a military objective. They had modeled the interception vectors. But in the halls of the Kremlin, there were still skeptics who believed the space pirate theory was too fantastic, too Hollywood. Then, the footage from Discovery arrived. It was not a grainy spy photo. It was a high-definition television broadcast, beamed globally by NASA. The image showed two American astronauts, Joe Allen and Dale Gardner, floating untethered in the black void of space. They were wearing white spacesuits and flying the manned maneuvering unit, essentially a jetpack. They were not fixing a telescope, they were hunting. Their targets were two communication satellites, Palapa B2 and Westar 6, which had failed to reach their proper orbits earlier that year. They were drifting, useless, dead objects. The mission profile for Discovery was unprecedented. Rendezvous with the satellites, capture them, load them into the cargo bay, and bring them back to Earth. The Soviet generals watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded. They watched astronaut Joe Allen fly over to the massive Westar satellite. They watched him use a Stinger device to physically dock with the satellite's nozzle. They watched as the shuttle's robotic arm, the very arm the GRU had frantically investigated, reached out, grabbed the satellite, and lowered it gently into the cargo bay. Then, they did it again for the second satellite. Two satellites, captured, stowed, stolen from the sky. This was the shock moment. The incident from Part 1, the vision of a white plane swallowing a Soviet station, was no longer a fever dream. It was a demonstrated capability. The Americans had just proven, on live television, that no object in low Earth orbit was safe. If they could grab Westar, they could grab a Yantar spy satellite. They could grab a Salyut station. The ease with which the Americans performed the feat was the most terrifying part. There was no desperate struggle. It was a routine industrial operation. The astronauts even held up a "for sale" sign in the window of the shuttle before re-entry. To the Americans, it was a joke about salvaging insurance assets. To the Soviets, it was a display of absolute dominance. The reveal was complete. The shuttle was exactly what the pessimists had feared, a machine capable of sanitizing the orbital environment of enemy hardware. The reaction in Moscow was a mixture of vindication and panic. The abduction theorists at the Keldysh Institute were proven right. The threat was real. Now came the futile response. The Soviet Union could not let this challenge go unanswered. They had to defend their high ground. But how do you defend against a spaceship that can glide, maneuver, and grab? Their first response was defensive and deeply paranoid. New protocols were rumored to be installed on sensitive Soviet military satellites. These were not scientific upgrades, they were self-destruct packages. The logic was grim. If the shuttle grabs you, blow yourself up. It was better to destroy the technology than let it fall into American hands. There were even reports that the Soviets revisited the concept of the active defense. They had previously tested the R-23M tech, a modified aircraft cannon on the Almaz military space stations. Now, the idea of armed space stations seemed not just prudent but necessary. They envisioned a future where cosmonauts would have to physically shoot at approaching American shuttles. But the primary response was the Buran. This was the ultimate tragedy of the Soviet misunderstanding. Convinced that the shuttle was a military superweapon, the Soviet leadership poured the last remnants of their crumbling economy into finishing their own copy. They believed that strategic parity meant they had to have the exact same capability. They accelerated the Buran program, demanding it match the shuttle spec for spec. It had to have the same payload bay size. It had to have the same cross-range capability. It had to have the tiles. But this response was futile for two critical reasons. First, they were solving the wrong problem. The Americans hadn't built the shuttle to fight a space war. They built it to save money, which it failed to do, and to satisfy a specific Air Force safety requirement. The Soviets were bankrupting themselves to duplicate a compromise. Second, the technology gap was simply too wide. The Americans had the industrial base to produce the ceramic tiles and the computer chips. The Soviets did not. To build the Buran, the Soviets had to create entire new industries from scratch. They had to spy, steal, and reverse engineer every component. It was an agonizingly slow and expensive process. While the Americans were flying routine missions, launching commercial satellites, conducting science, and occasionally capturing a payload, the Soviets were bleeding their treasury dry to build a hangar queen. The countermeasure failed because it was a mirror image without a soul. The Buran was a magnificent machine, perhaps even aerodynamically superior to the shuttle in some ways, but it had no mission. The Soviets didn't have a commercial satellite market. They didn't have a need to bring things back from space. They built it solely because they were terrified of the American space pirate. In 1987, the Polyos battle station, a prototype orbital laser platform designed to blind American defenses, failed to reach orbit. It was a desperate attempt to regain the lead. Then, in 1988, the Buran finally flew. It launched, orbited the Earth twice, and landed automatically. It was a technical triumph. The Soviet engineers had done the impossible. They had matched the Americans, but it didn't matter. The shock of the shuttle was not just military, it was economic. The United States could absorb the cost of the shuttle program. The Soviet Union could not absorb the cost of the Buran. The chase had exhausted them. The Soviets had spent a decade preparing for a mid-air heist that would never happen, while their own country was being stolen from beneath their feet by economic collapse. The verdict of history can be measured in many ways: in treaties signed, in walls torn down, or in borders redrawn. But in the case of the space pirate mystery, the verdict can be summarized by two numbers: 135 and 1. The American space shuttle fleet Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour flew a combined total of 135 missions. Over the course of 3 decades, they became the defining icon of humanity's presence in space. They launched telescopes that peered into the beginning of time. They built a space station the size of a football field. They carried hundreds of astronauts from dozens of nations. Despite the tragedies of 1986 and 2003, the shuttle was a workhorse. It was a tangible, operational reality that projected American power every time its main engines ignited. The Soviet Buran flew exactly 1 time. It launched in November 1988, unmanned into a grey, overcast sky. It performed flawlessly. It was a technological masterpiece that in many ways corrected the flaws of the American design. It had safer liquid fuel boosters. It had a fully automated landing system. It was arguably the better machine. And then, it never flew again. This stark statistical gap, 135-1, is the ultimate proof of the American dominance that the Soviet generals feared. But the dominance did not come from a laser weapon or a mid-air abduction. It came from a much simpler, more brutal reality. The United States could afford to be wrong. The Soviet Union could not. The space shuttle was, by NASA's own admission, a flawed concept. It failed to lower the cost of access to orbit. It was dangerous and complex. But the American economy was robust enough to absorb the cost of this magnificent mistake and keep flying. The Soviet Union, however, had been lured into a trap of its own making. The paranoia regarding the abduction capability of the shuttle had forced them to commit the greatest sin of the Cold War. They tried to match the Americans dollar for dollar without having the dollars. The Buran program was the single most expensive project in the history of Soviet space exploration. It consumed billions of rubles at a time when the Soviet economy was entering a death spiral. It sucked resources away from computer research, from consumer goods, and from the modernization of their conventional forces. And for what? They built a multi-billion ruble copy of an American truck, only to realize they had no cargo to put in it. They didn't have a commercial satellite industry to launch. They didn't have a massive space station ready to assemble. They had built the solution to a problem they didn't have, simply because they were terrified the Americans knew something they didn't. This is the macro theme of the mystery. The triumph of innovation over imitation. The Americans innovated. They created the shuttle to solve a specific set of American problems and Air Force demands. It was an organic product of their chaotic, democratic system. The Soviets imitated. They saw the shape of the shuttle and assumed the function followed the form. They assumed the massive wings were for war, not for cross-range safety. They assumed the cargo bay was for theft, not for deployment. They let their enemy dictate their industrial strategy. In doing so, the United States achieved a strategic victory without ever stealing a single satellite. The mere existence of the shuttle forced the Kremlin to bankrupt itself, chasing a ghost. The legacy of this paranoia is visible today, if you know where to look. It lies in the desolate steppes of Kazakhstan. For years, the Buran, the only Soviet shuttle to ever fly, sat collecting dust in Hangar 112 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. It was a king without a kingdom. The technicians who built it watched as the paint peeled, and the tiles, those precious, reverse-engineered ceramic tiles, began to fall off. Then, in May 2002, the final act of the tragedy occurred. The roof of Hangar 112, neglected and rotting after years of post-Soviet poverty, collapsed. It didn't collapse because of an American airstrike. It collapsed because of poor maintenance and the weight of accumulated water. The debris crushed the Buran completely. The machine that was built to challenge the might of the United States was destroyed by the simple, crushing weight of economic neglect. It was a poetic, if heartbreaking, end. The symbol of Soviet high-tech paranoia was buried under the rubble of its own infrastructure. Today, another test model, known as Ptichka, or Little Bird, still sits in a nearby hangar, rotting in the darkness. Urban explorers occasionally break in to photograph it. These images haunt the internet pictures of a decaying white spaceplane covered in bird droppings, surrounded by the rusted gantries of a superpower that no longer exists. It serves as a tombstone for the Cold War mindset. As we look back on the incident from 1976, we can see the irony clearly. The Soviet generals were right to be afraid, but they were afraid of the wrong thing. They looked out their windows and saw a space pirate coming to steal their satellites. They prepared for a physical battle in the vacuum of space. They prepared for grappling arms and diving attacks. But the real threat wasn't the arm, it was the idea. The shuttle was a psychological weapon. It projected an image of such futuristic capability that it broke the will of the opposition to compete on their own terms. It made the Soviets doubt their own mathematics. It made them doubt their own strategy. In the end, the mystery of the stolen satellite was never about a physical theft. The shuttle didn't steal the Salyut station. It didn't steal the Almaz. It stole the future of the Soviet space program. The Americans built a flawed, beautiful, dangerous ship that flew 135 times. The Soviets built a perfect copy that flew once and then died along with the empire that birthed it. And high above us, in the silent black, the satellites continued to drift, safe and untouched, watching the empire below them fade into history.